Okay, in this video and the next, we're going to talk about how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide imaginary numbers. And I want to give a slightly more precise term here. These, I'm calling them imaginary numbers, but the better name for them is to call them complex numbers. And complex doesn't mean like the English meaning of complex usually means something complicated. Complex means a combination. So these numbers that you see right here are a combination. We can write them in the form a plus b times I. So for example, this one right here is negative 8 minus 7i. It's a complex of the real part of that number, which is negative 8, and the imaginary part of that number, which is minus 7i. Okay, believe it or not, all the number before you ever learned about imaginary numbers, you had been dealing with complex numbers your whole life, because any number at all can be written as a complex number. For example, the number 3 is the same thing as 3 plus 0i. Right? This has a real part of 3 and it has no imaginary part at all. So you would never write it like that. You would usually just write it as 3, but in theory it's still a complex number. Okay, then you could have a pure complex number, so 5i. Another way of writing that is 0 plus 5i. So this has only an imaginary part and it really doesn't have a real part, or the real part in this case is 0. So I call them imaginary numbers, but I'm going to use the phrase complex number just to be a little bit more precise. Okay, so we're going to talk about how to add, subtract, and multiply these numbers. And with subtraction is actually slightly harder than adding. With adding, if you had, we'll actually see both ideas in action on problem number 1. Okay, so what I'm going to do is remove the parentheses from the first thing because we don't need that there. And then when we have a negative in front of a parentheses, what we need to do is distribute it, which means multiply it into that. So negative 1 becomes positive 1, and negative times this positive 7i becomes negative 7i. So we're getting both adding and subtracting. Now what we need to do is combine the like terms. So negative 8 plus positive 1 would be negative 7. And then negative 7i minus another 7i would be negative 14i. And that is our final answer. If we have a real part of that number right there with the negative 7, we have an imaginary part of the number right there. So that is our complex number answer. So that's how to add and subtract them. How do you multiply them? This is number 2. So multiplying, you might recognize that looks pretty similar, that problem, to problems that we've done before using FOIL. So that's exactly how we're going to do it. We'll FOIL this out. So first term would be negative 4 times positive 1, which is negative 4. The outside term, negative 4 times negative 6i. Negative 4 times negative 6 is positive 24, and the I just kind of comes along for the ride. Okay, the inside terms would be 8i times 1, and basically what we're doing is we're multiplying the numbers together, 8 times 1, and then the I is, like I said, by itself, so plus 8i. And then finally we have the last terms, 8i times negative 6i. 8 times negative 6 is negative 48, and I times I is equal to I squared. Okay, I times I equals I squared. Now here's what I want to point out. Hopefully you remember that I is equal to, or I is defined to be the square root of negative 1. So what is I squared in that case? Well, if you square this side and you square this side, squaring and square rooting are opposites. They cancel each other out. What that means is I squared actually equals that number right there. It equals negative 1. So we could rewrite the following and still have it agree with the original. Okay, minus 48i squared becomes minus 48 times, and we just said I squared equals negative 1. Okay, so this is important. Whenever you see an I squared in a problem, you should always replace it with the number negative 1, because that's what I squared equals. Okay, last thing is to combine the like terms here. So negative 4, this right here, negative 48 times negative 1 equals positive 48. So we're doing negative 4 plus positive 48. Sorry, that's a bit messy. Let me make it bigger. Negative 4 plus positive 48 is positive 44. And then finally we have 24i plus 8i, and that's equal to 32i. So there is our final answer. That's a complex number. It has a real part of 44 and an imaginary part of 32i. In the next video we talked about how to add, subtract, and multiply. In the next video we'll talk about how to divide complex numbers.